Sweden is one of the world's most prosperous and still peaceful countries. The ideal welfare state, civilized, disciplined, organized, generous to its poorest citizens. The acme of human rights and development. It wasn't always thus. For centuries, Sweden was an aggressive great power with an impoverished, oppressed population. A large proportion of its young males fighting foreign wars under aggressive, relentless warrior kings. It all ended ignominiously on the Ukrainian steppe in the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Sweden's biggest fiasco, and the empire slowly collapsed, so that by 1809, with the loss of Finland, Sweden had almost nothing left, and it was threatened by enemies on all sides, victims of prior Swedish aggression. Then Bernadotte stepped in, one of Napoleon's marshals, experienced, wise, and with a different perspective from the fanatic Swedish kings and aristocracy who only wanted to conquer their neighbors. Rather than siding with Napoleon against Russia, as his aristocracy wanted, and that's why they elected him and brought him in, he sided with Russia. His expertise as a French marshal was essential in getting into the mind of Napoleon and destroying him. He then set Sweden on a course of neutrality that lasted for 200 years. Sweden became a country of industry and education, focusing on self-mastery rather than the mastery of others, so that by the 1930s it was already one of the world's most advanced welfare states, and stayed out of World Wars I and II. But now I fear Sweden is slipping back into the old ways, with the NATO membership that has got the hotheads out in force. The propaganda has been relentless, and you wonder if Sweden has to suffer another disaster on the steppes of Ukraine before it sobers up, and some modern-day realist like Bernadotte was a realist takes over. Meanwhile, there are voices of dissent in Sweden, and I decided to talk to some of them. All the arguments are on their side, but the propaganda and the mainstream and the political classes are all against them.
Has shrunk. And it's not that journalists are less clever, it's just that they don't have the time anymore to dig deep into any one question. 20, 25, 30 years ago, there were so many journalists working at the different newspapers that it wasn't a problem for someone to spend, for example, 2 days looking into this story about children being kidnapped by Russia, if I just take one propaganda story. And now I can see that the journalist writing about this, she or he is a journalist that, you know, one day was writing about Trump, the next day that journalist is writing about MATS in Germany, and then that journalist is writing about the meeting in China. So probably this journalist had about 3 hours to look into this one topic on the children, so-called kidnapped children. And then she did what the journalists in Sweden do. They go to Financial Times, they go to New York Times, they go to The Guardian and Washington Post. And I have been in contact with certain journalists because certain journalists actually talk to me or answer my mails. And in some of the email replies I get, the journalist says, well, you know, I did fact check this. Thank you very much, because I in a very polite manner, ask them, have you actually fact checked this? Because I have these and these questions. And then they say, well, yes, I have, because I looked at Washington Post, I looked at New York Times, I looked at Financial Times. Oh, that's very good. And then I write back and I tell them, but dear Madam or Mr. Journalist, the sources in those newspapers are the same Ukrainian sources that you yourself are using, it's no different source. How have you checked the source? And then, there's no time for that, and we have to trust the Ukrainians because the Russians always lie. Okay, so that's the problem.
It's a very naive idea. I mean, everyone lies in war. Everyone commits. Of course, the Russians.
The first casualty of war is exactly. Truth, always.
And it's incredible that they're so naive about that. That the Ukrainians who are losing, of course, they lie. That's what they have to. That's the only thing they have is the propaganda war.
It's pressure. I would say it's societal pressure. It would cost them too much. I mean, I've lost friends. I have friends who unfriended me in silence. I have friends who have written me, you bastard, I'm not talking to you ever again, and things like this. And of course, if you're working as a journalist, or perhaps even if you're a freelance, you're very careful about what you write because you don't want to get defunded or dethroned or decapitated, the worst case scenario. So then you adhere to what is the accepted narrative. And I'm a privileged man. Financially, I'm able to be a dissident. I can say all this, what I believe to be the truth, and I can convey the other side's perspective. Because that's the problem right now, that there's only one narrative that's allowed to be presented in Sweden, and that is the Ukrainian. If we take that as an example, that's the Ukrainian narrative.
Mats Nilsson is a lawyer with the Department of Justice in Sweden. He's also in his spare time a leading figure inside the Dissidents Club, which puts out podcasts and articles criticizing the mainstream view of the Ukrainian war, which, in my view and his, is misreported in Sweden, which gives the Swedish public greater confidence in the West's ultimate victory than is merited by the facts. This overconfidence might lead to millions of more Ukrainian deaths, a collapsed European economy, not a collapsed Russian economy, and will bring us into war if we're not careful. A war that could destroy Sweden and the rest of Europe, and indeed the rest of the world. Peace is not cowardice, it's realism. Besides, there's a school of thought that the West was ultimately responsible for this war by carrying out provocations against Russia, breaking promises, scotching tentative peace agreements, endangering Russia's security, sponsoring coups in Russia's periphery, and coming fresh from conflicts in the Middle East where NATO was definitely responsible and the guilty one. Rocking up on Russia's doorstep, well, it's like having people with torches who've burnt your neighbours' houses down and now chanting slogans outside your house. Anyway, it's worth a debate, and this most important question for the Swedish nation at the moment is barely debated at all. Like the aristocrats who brought in Bernadotte in 1810, until Bernadotte turned on them and did the wise thing, the Swedish political class are insanely one-sided and fanatical in their views, convinced in the righteousness of their cause, even though in reality it's extremely damaging to Sweden's interests. Surrounded by his books about Pushkin, Tolstoy, the history of literature, and practically every book on geopolitics you've ever heard of, Mats Nilsson gives me hope.
You can feel quite lonely as a Swedish citizen these days, unless you adhere to the basic fact that Russia is evil, America is good, and the European Union is a blessing to us all. So, having been a Swede that grew up abroad, I spent my early formative years in Southeast Asia and in parts of the Middle East and also in Russia. I never really bought into the fact that America was the giver of all things good. So having returned to Sweden about 15 odd years ago, I started to feel that there was an optimism that was quite, it wasn't really based in any facts, it was just a feeling. And working against the narrative on your own in Sweden trying to talk to friends, trying to get one article into any newspaper, it started to prove difficult. So let's just say a band of lonely old men feeling that this was no country for them joined together, and we created we created the embryo of a think tank. But unlike the other Western financed think tanks in Sweden, we're only financed by our own ideas and by our own knowledge and by our own capacity, which is greatly helped these days by the wonderful era of the internet, where you can join up and join hands and exchange information with basically anyone around the world. So talking to you here in real life, it's a pleasure. But you can also, this evening perhaps, I can also contact, say, Kit Clarenberg and ask him for more information on an article I'm working on. So thereby, using everyone's different capacities, we in the Dissidents Club of Sweden have started to, in a more official way, challenge the news narrative that is constantly put through the Swedish mainstream media and of course the newspapers, which is and radio and TV. So every morning it's always detrimental to my blood pressure to hit that button and start listening to the Swedish news to see what they will pretend to know this morning, and then you have to follow that up.
Do you find, I mean, today the Expressen, which is Sweden's largest newspaper, I think, they appear in all the supermarkets, so that basically they have a highway into people's brains because everyone does their shopping and all the old ladies can see the headline and the banner headline. So they have a banner headline. That's the prime piece of propaganda property.
Oh yes, Putin has been declared dead. He's had cancer. He's been mad. He was losing. He was running out of rockets. He was needing to retreat. He was going to be thrown out by a palace coup. He drank deer blood to remain young. I'm not kidding about the deer blood. It was actually in the paper. So yes, the banner headline is the best way to gain presence within the Swedish mind. And I would say the Swedish mind is quite occupied. It's occupied and it's infiltrated, because propaganda is something that is constant. And once you see through this, once you see through the lies, which I once and for all did during the Libyan crisis or the attack on Libya, I had started to get a funny feeling after 9/11 and later the Iraq war. But then I finally penetrated that propaganda bubble, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I'm a lawyer by trade. I got my law degree here at Stockholm University once upon a time, and then I moved on into legal history. So I have an interest in history, I have an interest in the legalities of things, and I have an interest in foreign affairs and security issues. So if I mix all that together, you can say there is a kind of an, how shall I put it? It's an anatomy of propaganda from the West. And since Sweden is a part of the West, a lot of Swedes have difficulties understanding that they are actually subjected to propaganda, because they think the news that is given to them is neutral. I mean, they pretend like the Swedish state is neutral, and it's not good or bad, and it doesn't have any ulterior motives to what it does. But once you find out that that's not the case, that the Swedish government is obviously in cahoots with the Washington Empire and the Brussels system, you understand that everything that happens for a reason. And every decision taken is a decision to move us further and further into the clutches of the NATO and EU bureaucracy and world view. And like I said, what's been seen can't be unseen. And then every piece of news that arrives, you instantly question why, who profits, what's the point of this news, and what other alternative explanations can be given. And thanks to online intelligence, if you know where to look and if you know how to, that's one of the good things, having been educated to become a lawyer, is that you know how to make a forensic, you know how to do a forensic search. You know how to build a case in order to kind of get a conviction. And in many of the cases that's presented in the Swedish news media, you realize that they just took the banner headline, and all the rest of the text, it's just pure nonsense, because the facts point somewhere else. And that's the main objective of the Dissidents Club. It's to tell the people in Sweden about what's actually behind the banner headline. Now, they don't have to believe us, but the sources that we provide will at least make it harder for certain individuals to continue the propaganda on that singular matter.
Well, I'm going to speak in the voice of an outsider. I mean, I know Sweden, but somebody like our friend Giles or someone like that might say, well, hang on, we don't know much about Sweden, but we do know that it's top of the democracy ranking. It's top of the rankings for we want a free press, we respect free speech, and it's probably one of the world's best democracies. How, if Swedes are all these things, how do they have this terrible propaganda system? I mean, if I'm a foreign, let's say I'm an American leftist idealist who knows a little bit about Sweden, he must be incredibly disappointed by what you're saying, because what you're saying is Sweden is no better than the horrible America, and possibly worse.
Well, I wouldn't say we perhaps could have been worse, but we don't have the muscle to do this anymore. I mean, we are a nation, if not in decline, we have at least stagnated when it comes to the economy and when it comes to the industry, because we're losing our industrial base since we lost the cheap energy from Russia, and we're forced to buy more expensive energy, and we closed down our nuclear facilities. So I wouldn't say we're worse, but one thing that has always been a part of the Swedish system is that we have always been, the political sphere, the Social Democrats have always made a deal with the corporate elites. And we have quite a few corporate elitist families in Sweden, and one of the most famous is, of course, the Wallenberg family, which has been involved in Swedish affairs since the time around the First World War. And the family is, they work in the shadows, and they are just highly integrated within the political system. And they have their interests, and they try to align them with the interests of the Swedish state. The one recent examples I can give everyone is that when Sweden and Finland were in the process of applying for a NATO membership, the then Social Democratic Minister of Trade, I think it was, took a trip to Finland, which is of course normal, nothing strange. However, he was joined on this trip by members of the Wallenberg family. So both the Wallenberg and the Social Democratic minister went to Finland under the guise of discussing future cooperation and trade and things like this. But obviously NATO issue was also discussed. So and it was also the same during the Libya crisis, when the then Social Democratic leader said that he didn't really want to join, but Wallenberg and the Saab company was quite involved, saying that it would be really good for us in future to be able to sell JAS if JAS at least somehow took part in the Libyan action. And then of course the decision was changed. So Swedish JAS Gripen planes did take part in the destruction of Libya. And once again, Wallenberg was involved, and you can trace this further back. So in that sense, Sweden looks just like America when it comes to intertwining politics and the military-industrial complex. So we're not all good.
I mean, Sweden, I guess, among older people, there's this lingering memory of Olof Palme and Sweden's period as a neutral country between East and West, and a place where all peace conferences was Helsinki or Stockholm, and the Swedes were trusted international diplomats, and they sold their anti-colonial credibility. You know, they'd go down to Africa and say, we're the good white man, and in a way I think that's partly because the Swedes had and especially Olof Palme had a complex about the Second World War. They hadn't fought on the good side in the Second World War, so they tried to get, and the British, I studied and written about this, hated them because they thought, well, for people born in around 1900, 1910, the Swedes were the cowards, and then suddenly they were the good guys in Africa, you know, and the Brits didn't appreciate that at all. But but even during this neutral period, there was a very strong military, you know, a very strong. Sweden had built all these defense. I mean, it was a law to have an air raid shelter in every block of flats, right?
Yes.
And they had these tunnels and caverns everywhere where they had jet bases, and then Sweden had almost the only small country with its own indigenous defense industry. I mean,
yes.
Bigger than
And we could have developed a nuclear bomb if we had chosen to politically, because we had the capacity to do so. And I think that would have saved us a lot of trouble if we had. But that's a whole other matter. Yes, Sweden was I think at the height of our strength between 1958 to 1968, somewhere along those lines. We could put up a standing army of 800,000 men and numerous different fleet assortments of ships and airplanes. So we could hold our own without any trouble. And that gave us a position in the world. But during this time, we had a secret, we were very deeply intertwined with NATO. Let's not forget that. This was one of those known unknowns within both Western and the Soviet bloc. The Soviets knew that Sweden had shenanigans going with NATO, but they decided not to push the point. However, Finland was truly neutral during this era, and they did it out of necessity. But let's not kid ourselves. Sweden was very, very intertwined with NATO, even during our position when we were so-called neutral. And I think we did this because there were so many connections between the Swedish military and the Western military, because Russia and the Soviet Union has always been a very easy boogeyman in Sweden. We have had, apart from Denmark, which Denmark is Sweden's #1 enemy. We've fought more wars with Denmark than any other nation. But aside from Denmark, Russia is the #2 enemy. And Russia has always been cultivated as this enemy. So it was natural for Swedish military. Before World War II, we were very oriented towards Germany. Then, for obvious reasons, Germany couldn't be our go-to country anymore. So America became our go-to country.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, in 1940, the Swedish military went down to 1939 went down to celebrate Hitler's 50th birthday, and the chief of staff, I can't remember his name, but gave a statue of Charles XII, Karl XII, to Hitler.
Yes.
I mean, is that a message or what? Right?
Yes, of course. We were within those spheres. There were a high amount of anti-communism and a high amount of hatred towards Russia. So it was quite natural for us to seek comfort within the German cultural sphere. And I think a lot of people disliked the Nazis because they were considered brutish, but they were still German, so that trumped the Nazi label. And also during the Winter War, the first war between Soviet Union and Finland, the Swedes were quite quick to send troops towards to help and assist the Finns. During the continuation war, not so much, because that was partly Finland's own mistake. But during the first Finnish war, we helped Finland against the Soviet Union, and that is also a part of, how shall I say, the narrative of Sweden. So.
But what, I mean, the point is this focus on the Swedes are convinced that Russia is an aggressor, whereas the Russians see the Scandinavians as part of a European continuum of aggression, and they see the Swedes. I wonder if the Wallenbergs, they run Sweden very well, and they run Sweden with the kind of industries that could easily transfer to Russia, which is, timber and mining, right? And they probably have their. Do you think they have their eyes on Russia, thinking we could run that much better than the Russians could?
Oh yes, of course I do. Of course I do. I mean, if I go into my historical mind, if you look at it, the West, and especially Britain, has had their eye out on dividing Russia, I would say, since the time of the Crimean War. And Britain has also had their eye out for dividing China since the time of the First and Second Opium Wars. So the British have always had a fear of the Eurasian continent as such, and they always would have been happier if the Soviet Union had disintegrated into more pieces than it did. And that wasn't for lack of trying, mind you. I think that if it was Pompey or Cheney that said they wished that the Russian Soviet Republic had become more or many more republics than just Russia. So, and I think that will is still there. It still exists, and this is actually just what we're seeing right now. When Sweden has joined hands with the Washington, London, Brussels Iron Triangle against Russia, it's just a continuation of the Crimean War, when the big game was to try and dislodge Russia from this immense, powerful area that it controls. And it's just sad that Sweden takes part in this, because given our geography, we're on the fringe of the Eurasian continent, for better or for worse, but you do not move a country. You can move people, but you don't move a country. So since we're stuck here, it would make a lot more sense for us to start negotiations and cooperation with the BRICS countries. That would be good, but it might be good for the country, but it wouldn't be good for the Wallenberg industries.
Right. Well, I mean, I wonder, but would it? I mean, are there? I don't have any contacts in the Swedish elite or administration, or even among Swedish journalists. I mean, I want to shake a Swedish journalist by the collar and say, "Do you believe this stuff? Are you an idiot, or are you just lying?" You know, it's got to be one of the two. But I mean, does anyone discuss these things? I mean, or has Sweden been completely denuded of clever people? Because
I think that to a certain amount, the cleverness has shrunk. Journalists change their mind is if, for example, the New York Times debunk an article. A quick example was about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, there was a missile that struck a market in Ukraine. And of course it was a Russian missile. And everyone who did their online intelligence saw that no, it couldn't be, because the missile came from a different direction, and it was quite obvious that it was a Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile. And of course, you know, I wrote this to the journalists and they didn't answer me. And then the New York Times published an article where it said, this is actually not a Russian missile. And then I wrote back again and I said, well, you know, you did this and this, and why didn't you, listen to the facts I presented? And then they said, oh, well, we can't listen to everyone, and we always presume that it's a Russian. Basically, the answers I got was basically, we presume it was Russian unless someone proves us very, very wrong. So once again, the journalists in Sweden have an occupied mindset. They're very much in sync with the NATO narratives.
I mean, there's less dissent. I mean, even the Telegraph has now, which is a very right-wing, close to the military paper in London, based in London, they are publishing dissenting articles now. Hallelujah. So, but the Swedish are not. They're still colonized. And this is so sad because the Sweden has an older history as an independent nation state. It's like 1,000 years or something. Never been occupied, never colonized. And yet they're allowing themselves to be colonized by the Anglos. I mean, what's that saying? It's your best friend. It's those who love that kills you. And it might be, the Swedes have been grown up, they say we don't want Russian propaganda, and by that they mean they don't want 5 minutes of exposure to Russia today by chance. But they have 6 hours, 8 hours a day of exposure to British and American culture. They lap up all these British TV series. Isn't that an advertisement for the British way of life, you know? And then they can't believe that these funny guys, these English people whose language they speak, can lie to them.
It's very true, and once again, both America and the United Kingdom, if I start with the United Kingdom are very good at the concept of soft power. For most Swedes, the UK it's basically Downton Abbey, the murders in Midsummer, and all the rest of those cozy, warm, the Dales and the Glens of England kind of series, which you connect to the United Kingdom. But once you go there, and if you travel to, if you go down to Hackney, or if you go to Birmingham, or if you head into the wrong districts up in the north of England, you realize that wow, this is actually kind of a crappy place. And it's the same with America. America is extraordinarily good at soft power. And where once again you have all these TV series with the strong middle-class American families, be it the Huxtables or be it Friends, or be it whatever kind of series you want. And then once again, when you travel there and when you go there and when you realize that the inner cities of most large the metropolis of the United States, these areas are war zones. I mean, there's 10 cities. You have this enormous drug epidemic, and America is quite, it's in dire straits. So the thing that is keeping the Western Empire afloat is that especially China has to figure out how they can enter the minds of the Western people by way of soft power. How can we start seeing that a lot of the cities in China are wonderful futuristic cities, which you haven't seen before? This is a part of the international, war of the minds.
Well, I'm going to say, we have a common friend, Matthias, who I think runs the Dissident Club with you.
Yep.
He was in China recently. I think
Yes.
his son works there.
Yep.
I'll tell you my little story, which was that, I've lived long enough that the British and Americans are recycling. So it's like Superman Part 15, James Bond Part 32, Downton Abbey, the remake, but with black actors, sort of thing. Everything is recycled, and they're filming the same 2 or 3 squares in London, the same Hollywood Boulevard, the same Malibu beachfront, and we know that, and maybe each new generation is entranced by it, but meanwhile the Chinese are building things that are 10 times as big, and maybe you see it on a little YouTube video, and then you think, well, this can't be true because it's China, so it's propaganda. But like chunking, for instance, that's amazing 21st century. They're already in the 2050s, and we're still living in the Holocaust and Hitler in 1945, or Munich and Chamberlain 1938, or something like that. We're really living in some kind of
in a
post Bretton Woods narrative or something,
which is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Because if you don't realize, if you don't adapt to the factual strength of your empire, you're bound to destroy your empire totally. If you can have a controlled deconstruction of your old imperial powers, then you will at least be able to save quite a lot of it, at least enough to keep the people within your country happy enough so as to they don't revolt or create a revolution. The problem is, if the European Union were to lead their countries into a hot war with, for instance, Russia, and then things would start to disintegrate on a societal level. You know, you wouldn't have food, there would be problems with fuel, there would be problems with medicines being sent to the European Union. If Iran, for example, closed the waterways, whatever might happen in a globalized world, then whatever power the European Union had before, it's going to be just destroyed in a maelstrom of different kind of small revolutions. So what I'm just a friend of Sweden. I don't care more for Russia than I do for America per se, but objectively, from a Swedish point of view, it makes more sense to have negotiations and relations towards the BRICS countries than towards the old Washington dollar-based system. And why do I think this? It's because I want to save what can be saved from a European perspective. Because otherwise Europe is just going to split apart and be thrown into something which is going to cause a lot of grief for many middle-class citizens in Sweden.
I told Mats I went to Gothenburg recently, the second biggest city in Sweden, and I attended an anti-NATO demonstration. Having remembered the huge demos of the 1980s when women's groups marched from Minsk to Paris or from Paris to Stockholm, and you had the Greenham Common protests and hundreds of thousands turned up to protest against nuclear war. It wasn't very impressive that a country had been neutral for 200 years and suddenly, without a public vote or referendum, was brought into NATO, that only 8 people, mostly elderly, could be summoned to the anti-NATO demo that I'd witnessed.
The peace movement has been discredited. If you look back upon the peace movement during the previous century, it was a movement where politicians, professors, cultural elites, they wanted to be seen together with the peace movement. Nowadays, it's been fragmented. I mean, society has been fragmented, and you can't really bring yourself to gather huge crowds because you're quickly discredited for being a useful idiot or some other word used. The Dissidents Club the Dissidents Club is just lonely old fools who grew tired of being strange by ourselves. So we joined together, and strangeness in numbers suddenly gives you a credibility. And we're also trying to focus on cultural issues. We're looking into literature, we're looking into music, we're looking into the psychology of opposition, the psychology of dissent. So we're trying to get more of a including on a societal level what's needed in order to create an or rather what's needed to create a peace movement, as it were, before. So you can gain traction for actually being able to say that we're heading towards war and no one is going to gain anything out of this policy.
As I leave Stockholm, I pay my respects, or you could call it that, to the Charles XII statue, the most famous statue in Sweden. Sweden's last big warrior king, the man who lost the Swedish and Ukrainian army at Poltava, and whose actions ended the Swedish overseas empire. Portrayed as a hero warning against the Russian threat, he's standing in a central square pointing east, pointing at Russia. It's a famous statue, everyone in Sweden knows it, and for many years nationalists turned up on the day of his death, the 13th of November, with wreaths and sang patriotic songs. For many in the Swedish military, Charles XII's shadow looms large. a man who had ambitious plans a century before Napoleon, 2 centuries before Hitler, to sweep into the Eurasian landmass and conquer Russia, whose resources would make the small Swedish country of Sweden truly great. 100 years later, Sweden lost Finland, which had been Swedish for 500 or 600 years, and Sweden was reduced to the small country, more or less, that it is today, focused on domestic achievements. But no mean achievements. Became a hugely successful, prosperous country, a science and education and welfare state superpower, and all thanks to a Frenchman, an outsider, Bernadotte, who came and shook up the Swedish elite. Bernadotte had served with Napoleon, and the Swedish elite thought that Napoleon's favourite marshal would allow Sweden to align itself with Napoleon in his invasion of Russia. But Bernadotte knew better. Bernadotte knew that Napoleon was cruising for a bruising, and he aligned himself with Russia. And Russia and England and the Grand Coalition eventually defeated Napoleon and his imperial realms. He got Norway as a consolation prize for losing Finland, and holding on for that for 100 years allowed Bernadotte and Sweden to be an almost impregnable fortress in the north with no borders that could be threatened, and allowing Sweden to prosper materially and technologically. He had the gift of being a foreigner and a wise, strategic intelligence who could see what the local Swedes couldn't see. He knew the lay of the land. What's sorely needed is somebody who could see the lay of the land today. BRICS, multipolarity, a new world order, Russia, Iran, China, maybe even Trump's United States. Sovereigntists. Instead, the Swedish elite are tying themselves to the mast of globalism, globalization, the Western community, NATO, the EU. All of it is heading down. There's a statue far, far less known than the Charles XII statue, which has pride of place in Stockholm. It's a statue with Alexander I and Bernadotte sitting and standing and talking to each other. It's in Turku in Finland, where the two men met in 1812, I think, and decided upon an alliance, a Russian-Swedish alliance, that then morphed into Russian-Swedish, British, Prussian-Austrian alliance. This Russian-Swedish alliance, promise of non-interference, is almost completely unknown in Sweden, because it's almost unthinkable for the Swedish establishment, the media, the political class, the military intelligence class, to imagine that anything could come good of an alliance or a friendship with Russia. Maybe they need to think again and learn more about their history than they do already. Sadly, Bernadotte, the best king Sweden ever had, who spoke French all his life and never bothered to learn the language of the small and now geographically and politically insignificant country he ruled, and who loaned his personal fortune to pay off Swedish debts and brought in a better education system. The founder of modern Sweden, basically. He's almost unknown in Sweden for his achievements. In a table of the best kings Sweden ever had, apart from the modern kings, familiar but personally to a generation of older Swedes, it's the old, tired old warrior kings, Charles XII, Gustav Adolphus, Charles X, who have pride of place. These kings who brought nothing but ruin to Sweden. Bernadotte, this brilliant foreigner who founded the modern Bernadotte dynasty, he was voted in by 0% of the Swedish public. What does that tell you?